to that. And it is all that we for. Why don't we start with prayer? This time, can I ask my elder to let us think of prayer? Oh yeah, please.
Let's bow our heads. Gracious and Heavenly Father, what a nice Sabbath we've had today. And we would just pray that you would be with us here today as we continue learning more about creation and how we can defend it, how we can speak intelligently about it versus the other theories. We thank you for Monty and all of the knowledge that he brings to us. We pray a special prayer for him and his family, his wife, as they await the birth of their 3 sons. So just draw close to them, keep them calm and confident, and let them feel your presence. As we feel your presence here today, as our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Thank you all for coming out. So we talked a little bit about philosophy first night, and I mentioned a couple of the really big questions for creationist scientists. And one of the first questions is the fossil record. We really don't know how to explain how all those animals got in the order that they're in. It's very clear that they were deposited rapidly by water, catastrophically. How they got in the order that they're in is really a mystery. Not complete mystery, but like, why is it the same all over the earth? It's just really an interesting problem. And so that's something that kind of makes sense in evolutionary theory. Superficially, it makes sense in evolutionary theory. I say superficially because there really are no missing links. You'd expect missing links everywhere, and we really don't find any. I mean, what I mean by any, out of millions of fossils, we find a handful that are considered missing links. And when you really start digging into some of the most well-known fossil lineages, like whales, for example, like there's supposed to be a really nice transition between Pakicetus, which is kind of a wolf-sized quadruped, and that's supposed to kind of transition into a whale. And it's supposed to have 9 million years, but then you start really looking at the fossils, they find more fossils that contradict previous stuff they thought. They realize that the time that they thought they had just vanishes when they start digging other places. And so you end up with all these problems. And so we really don't have good missing links. And then the other problem is that we have radiometric dating, which we measure radiometric dating in a laboratory, and it appears that there's nothing that we can do to change it. And yet it gives nice, consistent dates for the most part through the history of the Earth. And so we don't really know how to explain that, and we definitely don't know how to explain how the tectonic plates and the radiometric dating tend to match. So I mentioned that the tectonic plates move apart about as fast as your fingernails grow. And if you take dates from the ocean floor, the radiometric dates match the expected growth rate over millions of years. So that's just interesting. Don't know why. But there are a lot of reasons in geology to doubt those really long dates. And I'll be talking about a few of my favorites. And I think hopefully a few of the most accessible ones. First, I want to give you an idea, though, of geologic history as it's understood by the scientific community, for the bulk of the scientific community. So, the idea is that Earth came into being 4.6 billion years ago, And so if we imagine those 4.6 billion years as 1 year, um, and just imagine that we're just walking through this year, we'll just walk for a whole year. Um, when we start off, everything is just super hot. There's molten rock everywhere. And it's like this for 1.5 months. So the Hadean eon, Hadean because it's hell on earth literally, ends on February 17. And then we move into the Archean. Arche is the Greek word for ancient, or beginning. And so the Archean eon, that lasts for 1.5 billion years. That's 4 months. So walking through that, we finally end in June 16 of the same year. So we've gone half a year, and we've seen a bunch of like hell on earth, and then it kind of cooled down. But there's not really much life to speak of. Finally, Proterozoic. Now notice this is almost 2 billion years of Earth's history. It lasts for 5 months. And finally, we start seeing bacteria for a long time. We start seeing algae. And then finally, at the end of the Proterozoic eon, you get an ecosystem that kind of looks like this stuff here. It's a really interesting ecosystem. Everything is soft-bodied. There's no predators at all. It's just a really bizarre ecosystem. And then, so November 18, that finally ends. And then something really interesting happens. We have the Cambrian explosion, and virtually every phyla comes into being in 4.4 days out of a year. So we are phylum Chordata, because we're chordates, we have a backbone. There are like 35 phyla, or 36, anyway, people, and basically the vast bulk of them all come into being, they all show up in these rocks. So we go from, so notice that, okay, this is November 18. We've gone through a whole, like from January 1 to November 18, just rocks and some bacteria, and finally a few life forms like this, and then just explosion of life in 4.4 days. And so that's just really interesting to everybody. And then over the next 19 days, we go through the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, and at the end of the Permian, we get this like creatures like this. You might think that that's a dinosaur. It's actually not. It's like Dimetrodon kind of animal, and these are thought to be the ancestors of the mammals. So us. And so that ends on December 11. Then over the next 15 days, we go through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And that ends December 26 in a massive fireball. This meteor hits the Earth, wipes out the dinosaurs. And that makes way for mammals to finally take over. So the Paleogene, Neogene, the next 5 days. This ends on December 31. Notice we're at the end of the year. And now we've got woolly rhinos, woolly mammoths, giant camels, giant sloths, and then the Quaternary. And this only lasts for 5 hours. The last 5 hours of December 31. And that's where you get most of human evolution. And Homo sapiens only exist for the last 23 minutes of December 31. Biblical history, the 6,000 years of biblical history, it lasts for 41 seconds of December 31. Okay, so you can, just to give you an idea of how long the history of life on Earth is thought to be in the standard model. Okay, so is there evidence that this is not really quite right? Well, one of the most interesting ones to me is biomolecules. So what I've got up here is just straight quotes from scientific news or scientific articles that have been published in peer-reviewed literature. And here says researchers now successfully retrieve nucleotide and amino acid sequences as well as lipid signatures, fat. So that's fat, protein, DNA from progressively older samples, originating from geographic areas and depositional environments. So like how the sediment was deposited. That until recently were regarded as hostile to long-term preservation of biomolecules. So they find stuff in an environment that they do not expect to find it, and it's got DNA in it, it's got protein, it's got hemoglobin, it's got just a lot of interesting stuff like that in it. So this is an interesting one. Can you see what, so there's a stalk and then a bunch of fronds, and another stalk here, another stalk here, some fronds here. These are crinoids, and they are relative to starfish, and the reason that we know they're starfish relatives is that they have five-way symmetry. They're symmetrical, like starfish have five feet, or arms, tentacles. Anyway, so these guys are also, if you cut the stem and if you look at it in a cross section, it's also got that five-sided symmetry. This says, though scientists have long believed that complex organic molecules couldn't survive fossilization, some 350 million year old remains of aquatic sea creatures uncovered in Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa have challenged that assumption. So 350-year-old crinoids yielded some original material, like original protein things. So that's just wild from an evolutionary perspective. Interesting one. This is a Pleistocene horse. Here we present a genome from a horse bone recovered from permafrost, dated to approximately 560 to 780,000 years before present. So not nearly as old, but they actually sequenced the genes of this horse, and DNA has a half-life of like 500 years under good conditions. So if we find human remains that are a few thousand years old, the DNA is very degraded. And this is supposed to be in the hundreds of thousands of years. This is a fun one here. Here we apply direct chemical techniques to categorically demonstrate the preservation of eumelanin. It's the pigment that we all have in our skin and hair and eyes. In two older than 160 million year old Jurassic cephalopod ink sacs, and to confirm its chemical similarity to the ink of modern cephalopod, which is the common cuttlefish. So they looked at this cuttlefish ink and the fossilized cuttlefish ink, and it's basically the same stuff as the modern cuttlefish ink. So that's just really interesting. Okay, and then it gets even crazier. A research team has, for the first time ever, discovered DNA from living bacteria that are more than 500,000 years old. They were able to cultivate these things in a petri dish in a lab. They dug them out of the permafrost and put them in a petri dish, and they grew. It's supposed to be 500,000 years old. So this is a problem because cosmic rays destroy bacteria DNA, and so it's been sitting there in ice, and it's been hit by these cosmic rays for 500,000 years, and it should have destroyed it, but they're alive, they're growing. This salt crystal yielded bacteria. It grew 30,000 years old, and the problem with salt is that it has potassium in it, and as you may know, potassium there's a certain amount of radioactive potassium. So when you eat a banana, you're actually eating some radioactive material. It's okay, it's not enough to hurt you, and you need potassium. But there is radioactivity in potassium, and so the amount of radioactivity that should have been there over 30,000 years should have killed the bacteria. An 8 million year old bacterium was extracted from the oldest known ice on Earth, is now growing in a laboratory. And this is a valley in Antarctica where they found it. It's supposed to be 8 million years old. And this is my favorite one of all. Bacteria locked inside salt crystals have just broken the world record for longevity. In the 19th of October issue of Nature, researchers describe how they isolated microbes from a 250 million year old rock formation. They're still alive. Okay, so the question is, did bacteria really live for 250 million years, or are they just not that old? So in the creationist model, there's not much difference between 250 million, 8 million, half a million, 30,000, and like 5,000 years. There's just like, those are all very similar dates in a creation model, because it all happened approximately the time of the flood. And so it's not a surprise to me that salt 250 million years old has living microbes, and salt 30,000 years old has living microbes, because in my head those are not that far apart. But this should be, I don't know, this is really strong evidence that salt is simply not that old. Okay, evidence for short chronology, the extent of the sedimentary layers, and this is also really good evidence for catastrophe. So if you think about river basins, all the modern river basins that you know about, think about the floodplain, think about the kind of deposits that rivers deposit, and think about the kind of deposits that would happen at a dam, where they build a dam and the river carries silt, sand down into it, and eventually fills it up. And sometimes they got to dredge that out to make the dam worthwhile. So think about the kinds of deposits that happen on Earth right now, and then think about the deposits that are in the fossil record. So this is the Grand Canyon, and one of the things I want you to notice right off is that the Grand Canyon is really just a very small sliver in the bottom of a much larger erosional event. So there's all these layers here. All of these layers have been eroded away. The Grand Canyon is right there. If you extend these layers up and over, they might have extended all the way over, they might not have. Some of them did, certainly, but a lot of the material is missing. But we can extrapolate. Here's Bryce Canyon, Zion Canyon. So this is several hours of driving between these places. And so you can see that all of this material just got washed away, and the Grand Canyon it's really just a very small piece of what happened. So some of the layers that show up in the Grand Canyon and Zion Canyon, this is the Tapete Sandstone right there. Look at it goes from Greenland all the way down to Mexico, and from the east to the west coast. And the Tapete Sandstone is catastrophically deposited. And also it lays on top of what's called the Great Unconformity, and the process that deposited the Tapete Sandstone raised off a lot of other material and then dropped the Tapete Sandstone on top. The Coconino Sandstone is much higher up. It's kind of toward the top of the Grand Canyon, and it covers Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, this whole area right here. The Navajo Sandstone covers a bigger area. It goes down into California, which you can't quite see, but it actually does. And all the way out up into Canada, and actually not too far from us here. Yeah, so this layer right here is the Coconino Sandstone. This is the Tapetes right here. So Tapetes continues on over here. Coconino continues. And then the Navajo is these white cliffs right here. This is Navajo here. Okay, so this is you can't see this picture very well, but there's a person standing here, and that's a boulder in the Tapete Sandstone. So there was enough energy in the deposition of this sandstone that it dropped this huge boulder right there. I mean, it moved it across the continent and set it there. One interesting example, you've heard of the White Cliffs of Dover, probably. They can be traced to Kazakhstan. It's an extremely widespread deposit. There's even deposits similar to it, I think, in North America also. Cretaceous. This is a Cretaceous deposit. Cretaceous means chalk. And so these are chalk cliffs. And chalk actually comes from the body, the skeletons of little marine organisms that have died and sunk down to the bottom. Evidence for short chronology. Okay, flood basalts. This is an interesting one. Bear with me here. This is a map of some of the Siberian traps. And here it says lava, and this is tuff. That's Russian, sorry. So the purple is black lava, it's basalt. The red is tuff, which means volcanic ash that's fallen over an area. And it's a huge area. You can see here's Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kamchatka. And on the left, this is what these flood basalts look like. It's layer after layer after layer of what used to be lava. Now on the right, this is what happens when some similar lava erupts in Hawaii. You get this pahoehoe. I mean, there's more than one type of lava that erupts in Hawaii, but you get this pahoehoe, which is, it forms lobes generally, because there's not enough of it. Now, if you think about, just imagine, what's a good, think about the consistency of corn syrup. If you were to dribble it out into the snow, and just dribble it slowly, you'd get kind of a formation that looked probably something like that. You get it forming little, it would cool, if you freeze it, it would cool into little, if you had food coloring mixed in, different food colorings in there, you could cut it later and you could see all the different separate colors, right? But if you just dump a bunch of it and then it cools, you'll get a very consistent, flat, just cake of solid corn syrup once it cools down. So this is the difference between what's going on here. So you can actually calculate how much lava got extruded in each of these and how fast it happened in each of these layers. And there's no erosion there's no weathering, no erosion in between any of these strata, in between any of these caps of lava. So what we have here on the left is this is a picture of like a fissure opening up in the earth, dumping out a vast amount of lava. And then another huge extrusion on top of that, another one on top of that, another one on top of that, hundreds of times over. And all of this happening in a very short amount of time. So it's supposed to be 2 million years of Earth's history, but there's simply not 2 million years of weathering there. And also these events are extremely catastrophic and rare in Earth's history. Every single time one of these erupts, it's going to really disrupt the environment. So we don't have anything like this in modern Earth, thankfully. If you imagine you saw the area, this whole thing right here, there's similar deposits in Washington State, in India, and other parts of the world. And these things happened, in my view, during the flood. And if we had something like that happen on Earth right now, it would be catastrophic for the entire planet. This is what I just explained. Okay, coastal erosion. This is a bit of a review from last time. But coastal erosion costs the U.S. $500 million a year. It affects 90% of the world's coastlines. Erosion rates in California are 0 to 42 centimeters per year on average, and it's only 4.5 billion meters from Los Angeles to New York City. So if we choose an average erosion rate of 20 centimeters a year, the California coastline would end up in New York in 22.5 million years. Now keep in mind, 22.5 out of 4.6 billion is nothing. So here's an old picture of a lighthouse, and there's a modern picture of the same lighthouse. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but the coastline really cuts in much further, much closer to the lighthouse, just in, I don't know, 40, 50 years. And this happens all over the place. They've had to move many historic lighthouses to save them from coastal erosion. So the coast of California could be eroded to New York 200 times in the history of the Earth, just based on modern erosion rates. And then we got river erosion. So same kind of problem, where we can measure how fast a river is eroding the basin. Every river has a base, like a catchment basin, where the Mississippi River Basin is very large, covers a large part of the United States, and we can measure how fast the Mississippi River is taking the earth that makes up that catchment and dumping it out into the ocean. This is the Tigris River, and it erodes its basin at a rate of about 260 millimeters every 1,000 years. So 26 centimeters every 1,000 years, not much, like that. Every 1,000 years. Doesn't seem like much, but you extrapolate that back millions of years, and you run into serious problems. So, just some very simple math, that's 260 kilometers every billion. So 260 kilometers of material should have been eaten away every billion years. Everest is only 8.48 kilometers tall, tallest mountain on Earth. And interestingly enough, Everest actually has fossil shells at the top still. There's limestone, there's marine deposits at the top of Everest. Now that doesn't mean that the flood came up and covered Everest. What that means is that there was marine deposit, flood deposit, and that then it was pushed up. But it's not been eroded off yet, which is the interesting part. It's still there. The Earth is not old enough to have eroded the flood deposits off the top of Everest. And it should have happened many times over. All right. Okay. Questions? Let's get the question on the mic.
Well, the question is the composition of the Earth on the surface not changing uniformly over the Earth?
You mean like the erosion rate?
Well, we say that Mount Everest, it grows up to where it is today.
Yeah.
So then that would lead us to believe that one time it was much lower.
Yes.
But that phenomenon is not happening all over the world. It's just global.
So Everest is a result of a collision between India and Asia.
Yeah.
And it just happens to have been an extremely energetic event. It really shoved those mountains up to extraordinary heights. When you look at, we're probably most familiar with the Rocky Mountains as far as big mountains goes. I've never been to the Himalaya range. I'd like to go. I've been to the Andes, and the Andes is an extraordinarily large mountain range compared to the Rockies. And the Andes only go up to 22,000 feet. I think the highest peak that I've seen is probably 19-ish. I didn't get to hike it, but the air is thin up there. And it's actually, the air is so thin up in the higher parts of the Andes that if you cut yourself, it doesn't heal until you come down to lower elevation. So, like, there's a town in the Andes, and they send the women down the mountain to give birth, just because it's just too, not enough oxygen up there, not enough oxygen available. And then the Himalaya range is thousands more feet of elevation. So these localized events, yeah, they happened all over. So one thing about that is that these mountains have come up since the flood. The reason that we have all these shell deposits, shell fossils up in the mountains is not because the floodwater covered that mountain, but rather because it covered the earth, and then the earth buckled, and parts of it rose, and parts of it sunk.
You probably saw me react to the White Cliffs of Dover. You stated that that was from Kyrgyzstan?
All the way to Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. Are those kinds of deposits, I don't even know how to ask, do they have a DNA, if you will, or the composition of these kind of deposits so individual that you can trace where they're from like that and know that they originated here and wound up there?
You can do comparative analysis and figure out where it's from. Now, what's interesting, though, is that I was walking through a mountain in California with my geomorphology professor, and he picked up a rock. I was like, oh, that's Miocene. I mean, that's a Miocene diatomaceous deposit. I'm sorry, that was, and sure enough, it was. And the reason that I knew that is because it looked just like rocks that I had studied in Peru. And so this was the same type of deposit in California that I had studied in Peru, and it looked very similar. Same types of fossils, same materials, diatomaceous earth that they use for swimming pools.
So have those kind of rocks migrated, or are they just that kind?
No, they got dumped in place there.
Huh. Next question. You keep talking about tectonic plates moving. Where are they moving to? I mean, eventually they'd all be bumping into each other and then start moving away, or explain yourself.
I would say that we don't have a good model to explain tectonic plate motion. So the reason I say that is because the official model for explaining tectonic plate motion, so we know they're moving, we can measure it with satellites, we can watch the mid-ocean ridges expand, we see striations of magnetic reversals on the ocean floor. So what that means is that, back after World War II, the Navy was doing very careful measurements of the ocean floor of magnetism, and they were getting, and what they eventually realized is that stripped the ocean floor, the Earth's magnetic field is reversed many times, and every time it reverses, little magnetic crystals in lava that it cools, or they line up with the Earth, and then they cool, and they get stuck that way. So we can pull a rock out, and we can put it into a machine, and it'll tell us what the orientation of the magnetic field is of that rock. And that tells us what the orientation of the Earth's magnetic field was when it was formed. And so if you look at a magnetic map of the ocean floor, you see. So let's say we have Europe and North America, and Iceland and the mid-ocean ridge, and so it's splitting at the mid-ocean ridge. It's oldest on the edges. Youngest in the center, and there's a mirror image away from the center of magnetic pole reversals all the way up to the edge. Um, and so we can see that the plates have split and shifted apart. How they did it, though, like they think that there's convection down inside the Earth's mantle, but the models for the convection really don't work very well. Like there's problems with none of the models are right.
So are they all going in the same direction?
No. No, there's lots of different directions. So sometimes the plates slip past each other this way, and you get like the San Andreas Fault, that I'm very familiar with. Um, when I was a kid, we had an earthquake that was so bad that I had to hang onto my mattress not to get tossed out of bed, and it knocked like a good third of the water out of my mom's swimming pool, and so that's this kind of fault. And then we have other faults where something slips under something else, or something is pushed up. If you remember the 2004 tsunami, there was a portion of the ocean floor that got shot up, and that created that wave. It was like a 9-point something earthquake, tremendous earthquake that shoved up the ocean floor, creating that shock wave. So I don't know if that really answered your question. So I would say that, well, no, yeah, we just don't know what's going on with tectonic plate. Yeah. My professors, so tectonic plates is actually a theory that's quite young, scientifically speaking. So I grew up with tectonic plates, but my professors did not. And one of my professors said years ago that the thing that finally convinced him that the theory of tectonic plates was correct was that earthquakes on plate margins get deeper as you go away from the margin. So the idea is that the Andes are pushed up here, South America, Pacific Ocean, right? So you got these Andes mountains here, and then there's a plate diving under the other plate at the margin, and you can see everything in the ocean floor. You can see very clearly that there's that plate diving, there's a wedge of material that's been scraped off of that plate, and it's sitting there. And then the earthquakes that happen are very shallow at where they touch. And then as the earthquakes happen deeper and deeper, closer and closer into the continent, they get deeper and deeper. And they can triangulate that using seismometers around the Earth. So that told him that yes, there actually is a plate that's diving under the other plate.
There was I think the History Channel came up with one on the Alps, and they were saying the north part of the Alps, however long that is, through like France and Germany and so on, there's a big trench, and they're saying that the Alps has washed away, filled that trench, and they've got a lot of smaller rocks, boulders. They can pinpoint where it came from.
Sure.
And they were saying, I was wondering, could this be possible that the Alps are half the size now that they were when they were actually pushed up? They cited the Eiger, not the Eiger, but what's that other one? The big tall pointed
The Matterhorn?
Matterhorn is from Africa, such that the African plate came up, and like he was talking about earlier, it slid up on top of the European plate, which came down. I'm just wondering, if these mountains were twice that size, is it possible?
I would say yeah, definitely, because one interesting thing about the Alps is that you can definitely see that they were carved out by glaciers. And so the Alps have unique topography to glacial features. And glaciers are far more powerful means of erosion than just water. So, sure, yeah, definitely.
And is that a lot of the stuff that happens to make all this move around and explode in the neighborhood?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's the primary cause or a secondary thing. So in other words, it looks like, so talking about tectonic plates, it appears, we can see from seismic imaging of the Earth. So every time an earthquake happens, they pick it up on thousands of seismometers all around the world, and they use really complicated processing to try to figure out exactly what happened and what the Earth looks like inside. And there are pieces, very large pieces of very cold ocean crust sitting down on the core mantle boundary. And then we've got this new ocean crust that is formed during the flood that covers our oceans currently. And so it looks like this old crust dove down into the earth, and this new crust is formed. And so I don't know if the fountains of the Great Deep breaking up were, I don't know if they broke up as a result of that process, or if there was something else that caused both things.
Because the flood is not just.
Right, there was water from underneath as well.
And it seems to me that end time was going to be something like that. Things turn up to be.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
says
know
that.
words.
Right, the Bible, yeah, it says that the elements will melt with fervent heat, and I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, mountains disappear, yeah.
Something like that might be the difference.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
You spoke of the rate of our shorelines eroding. Do you have any information on the rate at which deserts grow? My understanding is that the Sahara and some of those deserts, if they grow at a certain rate, and if that's taken backwards, it goes back to close to the flood time.
Interesting.
I just didn't know if you.
No, I hadn't seen that. That would be interesting, though. Yeah, they do grow, unfortunately. And it's interesting, you can see this in the Bible. If you read through the Bible and look at all of the animals that are listed in Israel, most of those have been pushed way into Asia and Africa, far away from the Middle East. There's no lions in Israel, or wolves or anything else like that now.
When I read the Bible, I get the impression that they lived off the earth there. So did things grow better then, in that time, in the Old Testament times, than they do today in Israel? You know, I get the impression Israel's a desert today.
It is a desert. I think one of the interesting things about the Middle East, about Israel specifically, is that apparently it used to be watered by springs. So we read that Sodom, the valley of Sodom, was a really lush valley, and now it's just desert. And so it appears that those springs dried up. And so that's something that if Israel had remained faithful, they probably never would have dried up. God would have kept whatever. Like, the Old Testament says that it talks about the earth vomiting out her inhabitants because of their wickedness. And specifically in the terms of like people that just like, in other words, it's saying that people actually can destroy the earth. And so the climate in Israel is not. It's just it's nothing like what it used to be in the time of Abraham.
Question about the human evolution that you alluded to, kind of in which you termed the current model. You showed some artist renderings of early humans. I'm wondering what the thinking around those findings are, and what kind of responses might you give to someone who was discussing human evolution from, a lower form to what humans are now. I don't know how to be more specific, but really I'm most interested around the, some of the skulls they find that seem to be described as much less developed than humans of some form.
So, that's a really good question, and that's actually. So I would say that there's a couple of different ways that people have looked at this. One is that that all of the fossils that we find can either be fit into two categories. They're either apes or they're humans. I could say that you could make a pretty good case for that. There are certainly, so for one of the reasons that we can make a case for that is that many of these finds are very fragmentary. And so it's difficult to know how much is being, how much embellishment is going on there. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of malformation caused by some kind of disease. I was watching I think, I don't know, National Geographic or something. There was a special on Java Man, and there was a group of scientists that were saying this is not a human ancestor. This is a guy that had microcephaly, for example. And so I think that there's a pretty good case to be made that you can pretty well fit these organisms into either human or ape category. I don't know that that's the complete answer. You can, there are some interesting, so like Neanderthals, I would say that Neanderthals are very clearly modern, like they're very clearly human. They buried their dead with ornaments. They wore clothes. They obviously had a fairly civilized. They had a complex social structure, but Neanderthal skulls, like if you feel your own head is narrower here than it is here, and that's a very modern human trait. It's not an ape trait, but Neanderthals were actually wider here than here. But at the same time, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. And something random interesting about Neanderthals is that they were also far more physically powerful than we are. Neanderthals had muscle and like their skeletal structure and muscular structure. What we can kind of guess at from what we see is that they were extremely physically powerful humans. That's a good question. They may have just become us. Well, so they've sequenced genomes of Europeans, and Europeans actually have Neanderthal genes. So they might have been a population of humans that just bred with other humans, and we're all a little bit Neanderthal.
So I have to ask a musical question. I only want your opinion. I've heard this discussed by other people.
Indeed.
Do you think in heaven there'll be more than 12 tones in an octave?
I would say that. I would say there already are. And but that's just the scale that we've chosen. It's not like it's not arbitrary. It's not completely arbitrary. But you can fit a tone in between all the ones that are there. Right? And I've heard people sing and use quarter tones very effectively.
I'll put it to a different way. In heaven, will we be able to hear much better than we can today?
Oh, absolutely. So So in heaven, will we be able to hear much better than we do now? No, I think we'll all be musical geniuses. I think.
Well, I have a question. I think I've seen this documentary or something that either Antarctica or North Pole somewhere that they are kind of drilling the ice to see the composition of CO2 and O2 level
Yeah.
to kind of come up with this hypothesis what kind of weather or climate back in a long time ago. Are there kind of research kind of match to what we see? It seems like they are also going back very.
Yeah, they said 8 million years.
Yeah.
In
So like,
Antarctica.
how do you kind of make sense of that in your equation?
So two things. One is that a fairly famous story is that they found some World War II airplanes on the closer to the coast of Greenland, not on the ridge of Greenland where they took the ice cores. And they've taken ice cores all over the world, but specifically Greenland, they found on the coast they found many, many more layers than a light and dark per year, or a clear and fuzzy per year, or whatever. Like true, yeah. And so they found many more on the coast than they did on the ridge. And so if we think of, I mean, maybe the conditions were not the same immediately after the flood. Maybe there were a lot more storms happening right there. For whatever reason, I mean, there's many reasons that it could have been a different number of layers. Now, what's interesting is that we do actually appear to have at least 2,000 years of really good data from ice cores. And they know that because they can find ash in the ice from volcanoes that erupted at historically known dates, and they can trace that ash chemically back to the volcano. But that only goes back a couple thousand years, and then beyond that, it's extrapolation, and much beyond that, you end up with ice layers that are so thin that they actually have to use computer models to extrapolate how many layers there really are. So you can imagine that a lot of error could get in if you have the wrong assumptions.
Based on what you're saying, maybe it's an okay assumption to say that the pre-flood Earth may not have had mountains. I mean, I would imagine it's dramatically different. Do you have ideas on what some of the things that you might expect to find that would be very different for us today?
There have been some interesting research by creationists. So one researcher proposed that the coal beds that we have all over the Earth, which are the remains of immense quantities of plants that were all buried together and compressed into coal. He figured that a lot of these probably came from floating ecosystems that existed before the flood. So it was a whole floating mat of vegetation, and this whole thing just got buried together. So that's an interesting theory. The other thing is that it appears that just from the sheer quantity of coal on the Earth, it appears that there was a lot of vegetation before the flood. So the Earth, and we know this from the Bible, the Earth was perfect when God created it. It was a very beautifully designed environment, designed for life. Of course, no deserts, no rocky mountains, and we can deduce that the environment was very different because there was no rain. So as the mist came up out of the ground and watered the earth. And the first rainbow was the one that Noah and his family saw when they stepped off the ark. Or the first recorded rainbow. So it seems that the earth before the flood was much more lush and just a lot of stuff just grew everywhere. And then all of that plant matter just got compacted into the coal. And like we got coal beds that are that would have required hundreds of meters of plant material, all piled in at once and buried to form the coal that we have. Yeah. Well, in Australia, he's got even more impressive ones.
I don't even know how to ask this, but you'll be able to answer it. I should have paid more attention in school, I know, but the glacial age, the ice ages, extended for long periods of time, maybe millions of years on some records. And, Minnesota history, we're told that this was once covered by glaciers. We've got glacial evidence. Talk about ice ages. How long does it actually, if we believe in a 6,000 year Earth, how long does it actually take for a glacial period to extend and recede, over part of the continent of North America, like we apparently have evidence that it did?
That's a good question. I would say that we've had, just in my lifetime, I would say we've had a huge amount of glacial retreat. I remember, pictures of Glacier National Park that were taken when I was a kid. The glaciers were much bigger than they are now. And so that partially answers the question. The other thing is that, so it's not hard for me to imagine that there could have been a lot of snow immediately after the flood, and that could have covered a lot of the world with, a lot of the northern climes with ice. And then as to how fast it melted, I don't know. We've got, some geologists would actually say that we're still coming out of the ice age. I mean, I've actually heard people say that. I'm not sure how, it really depends on how you define it. But I met a geologist, Bob Schock, at a conference, and his theory, he thought he had found evidence in Turkey of a catastrophic termination of the last ice age. In other words, he found evidence that the last ice age, whatever stopped the last ice age, was extremely quick. So that's interesting. Don't know. I don't know. He just found evidence that the climate had shifted abruptly. And I think that we've actually got a lot of evidence that the climate shifted very quickly. One little piece is that if you go to Antarctica, if they dig up plants in Antarctica that are locked in ice, well, what that basically means is that there were plants growing there, and then it got so cold so fast that they got covered in ice and never thawed out again. So that's another evidence for very rapid climatic change.
About 200 BC, Hannibal crossed the Alps, and a lot of people believe he crossed the Alps with elephants in passes that were clear of snow and ice. And since then, there's been another cycle where there's been a lot of snow, a lot of glaciers forming again. Is this part of the natural cycle of our Earth that every so often we're going to have a lot more snow, a lot of glaciers, and then it goes back again in a warming cycle again, and then it's that kind of a cycle, and we might be in the warming cycle right now. Is that possible?
It's entirely possible. Yeah. I don't know that it's hard for me to I don't know that we have enough data that's been interpreted well to really say what kind of cycle that would be, but yeah, it's possible.
At the beginning of your presentation, you showed us some pictures of the layers of the Earth and how all around the Earth, all the fossils are the same in each layer, but you didn't offer an explanation.
Yeah.
Well, according to an article I read on the creationist website Answers in Genesis, they suggested that the layers might have been formed as animals were fleeing flood, those who were or may have been higher up. I was wondering if you could give your thoughts and opinions on that.
I would say that that's a somewhat helpful hypothesis. Could explain part of the problem. I don't think it explains the whole problem. So, like, if you think about that on a local scale, sure, definitely. If you think about that worldwide, I don't know. So the theory is like the old theory is ecological zonation, and so the idea is that the layers of rock with all these different fossils, each one was a different ecosystem before the flood, and I think that that's helpful. I'm not exactly. I don't. It doesn't. Like, there's still data that doesn't fit very well. So it doesn't completely solve the mystery.
Are you familiar with the fossil, or not the fossils, but animal footprints in coal down in the southwest?
Yeah. That'd be interesting.
That and petrified logs in coal. There was a mine down there, I forget the name of the mine.
Yeah, I've definitely seen fossilized wood, and even wood that's not fossilized in coal, which is interesting. And one of the things that I've seen, like I've seen tree stumps with boulders lodged in them in coal. So that tells you that the tree just got ripped out and deposited with the coal. And I've also seen marine fossils in coal, shells and things. And so that also tells you that this was like plant matter that got, it was terrestrial plant matter that got wiped away, that got washed away by water and buried with marine stuff. Haven't heard about animal footprints though. That's interesting. Okay, interesting. Oh, all right.
It's more like more request than question. Like we had that conversation. I think it would be interesting if you can share that story of that whale fossil in Peru. The
Oh yeah. Okay.
I think that would be
Yeah.
kind of interesting, the implication for that, and also would you be willing to share your dissertation?
Sure.
And what the implication would be for
So I did my master's work down in Peru in the Pisco Formation, and Pisco it's sand, silt, diatoms, volcanic ash, and it's all a shallow marine deposit. It's still on the coast of South America, and it's got fossils everywhere. It's amazing. There's whales, dolphins, cormorants, penguins, seals, sloths that used to swim actually, and shells and fish. Amazing. Like we found a fish vertebra that was about this big around. So if you've ever seen a fish vertebra, just extrapolate in your head the size of a fish that would have a vertebra that big. And megalodon. We found megalodon teeth. The 45-foot shark that looks like great white. Found a bunch of ray teeth. Rays have flat oval teeth. Anyway, it's a really cool place to study. And one of the things, so this formation is supposed to have been, those depositions are supposed to have started about 22 million years ago and finished about 2 million years ago. So there's supposed to be 20 million years of history in the Pisco Formation. And what we found over and over again, though, was extremely rapid deposition, one thing on top of another. So to give you an example of that, there's a number of baleen whales, and it looks like these whales kind of caught a mouth of water full of silt and kind of just sunk down to the bottom and died right there with a mouthful of silt. And the baleen stayed stayed in place often. Not always. Sometimes the whale would die and the baleen, like there's one whale where we found the baleen had floated away and landed on top of the arm and was preserved right there. The baleen detaches within days of a whale's death. And so that's why if there's baleen in a whale's mouth, you know that it got covered and preserved very quickly. And the reason that this is important is because they've done a number of studies on dead whales where they'll send little aquatic drones down to the whale and photograph it over the months. Over months, you know, they'll see a whale die and they'll just follow it down and photograph it for several months and years. And so they know very well the sequence of what happens to a dead whale. And, you know, the flesh gets eaten by scavengers, and then the bones get eaten by scavengers, and then there's just nothing left 4 or 5 years later. And so think about, you know, a couple thousand feet or a few hundred feet or even a few thousand feet of deposit that's supposed to have taken place in 2 million years. That's not very much per year. And yet we see storm events that are dropping, you know, several meters of sediment all at once. And we see all of these marine creatures that have been just preserved extraordinarily well, which necessitates very quick deposition. So all of these, so we published a bunch of stuff on the Peace Corps Formation, and like an article in Geology, in Geology magazine, or Geology journal, rather, not a magazine, in one of my professors who's an author, he was trying to be conservative when he sent the article in, and he said it looks like that this whale was buried within weeks to months of death. And the reviewer wrote back and said, your data says days to weeks. and so they changed it back to days to weeks, because it really does look like that. And so this happened anyway. So you can just see that throughout the whole Peace Corps Formation that everything was deposited very quickly. My dissertation was in Arizona, northeast Arizona, and it was a geomorphological study. So geomorphology is the study of just how the surface of the earth is in the form that it's in, like what processes shaped the earth that we have right now. And you can do like historical geomorphology too, but I was looking at these huge potholes on the top of a desert mesa, and so we know that potholes form in rivers. And sometimes they'll collect rocks, and the rocks will, you know, pound around down in the pothole for a while. But so we know that we know that there's a lot of potholes in places where there's a lot of running water, but these are up on top of a mesa in the middle of the desert in Arizona. And I found 50 really big ones. The biggest 2 were 50 feet deep and 100 feet across. And there were a number of others that were really big as well. And so the question is, how in the world do you get enough water going over the top of a mesa to form potholes like that? And so in the West, where there's not much water, people kind of prefer to say, well, maybe weathering did it somehow. You know, over millions of years, perhaps, you know, weathering somehow carved these pits. But they really look like they were formed by water. So I had kind of a funny experience. I took my research to Geological Society of America, and I was expecting pushback because in the West, we don't really like to talk about water much because we don't have any. But Geological Society of America was in Indiana, and there's water here. And so I had my poster and I got no pushback whatsoever. Everybody's like, oh yeah, it looks like it's formed by water. So,
But when you're talking about these holes being mirrors, now, is this sediment that came down homogeneous natural sediment, or can you get all striation as these holes came down?
it was all laminated. So there would be a layer of volcanic ash, another layer of diatoms, another layer of sand and silt, another layer of just whatever.
Did that be related to certain dinosaurs that they found there?
There was certainly a lot of volcanic activity. I mean, this was ocean. This was the, you know, the coast, and so it does look like there was a lot of volcanoes dumping a lot of material into the seawater right there.
So it could have been very, very rapid.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to know, what do you think about what happened to the dinosaurs? How did that fit into communication?
Okay, no, that's a good question. So I think that,
What was the question?
okay, what happens? What happened to the dinosaurs? How does that fit into creation? Um, uh, a few things about dinosaurs. It seems like dinosaurs filled a just normal, necessary ecological niche in their environment before the flood. I mean, again, there was a huge amount of vegetation, and so dinosaurs probably, I mean, the big creatures, they probably ate a lot. They probably cleared out a lot of vegetation. I think that they were created by God. I don't think that they were necessarily, genetic tampering by humans way back whenever. Um, the Now the reason we don't have them now, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously the flood could have killed. I mean, the Bible says that God said, "I will destroy every creature in whom is the breath of life, every creeping thing." And so the animals that were not on the ark all died and got buried in all these layers. Um, Now, why we don't have them now, I don't know, except that we actually, uh, like, there's a lot of organisms that we see fossils of that don't exist anymore. Um, Dinosaurs stick out because they're so interesting. And so I tend to think that some of them did go on the ark.
Would it be all of them? Two by two
Right. So it does. The Bible does say that all the animals went on the ark. So it does seem like all the dinosaurs should have gone on. Um, yeah. As to why we don't have them now, I don't know.
I don't want to get up here, but the creationist website answers in Genesis what I mentioned before. They have an answer for that. They suggest that dinosaurs did indeed go on the ark and therefore came off the ark. But they explain the origins of the word dinosaur. That the word dinosaur was actually invented after the King James Bible was written. So we don't find dinosaur in the Bible. So when people ask why aren't dinosaurs in the Bible, we can answer they are. They just didn't have the word when it was written. Then they go on to compare dinosaurs to dragons.
Right.
In the passage of word of mouth, hand stories
If
down, and they mutate, change.
if you read about Behemoth or Leviathan in the book of Job, which is probably the oldest book of the Bible written. The first book of the Bible that was written is probably the book of Job. So if you read about Behemoth and Leviathan, you could definitely see, like, to me, those descriptions fit dinosaurs that I'm familiar with better than they fit any living organism.
Yes. Answers in Genesis has pictures.
All right.
Sorry, it's my go-to website when I have questions.
So it's not something that I would stake my life on, to be sure, but it's an interesting, like, I think at least it's a reasonable hypothesis.
If you imagine that they all got hunted out, then there's no question why we don't have them anymore, because how many animals go extinct every year?
Yeah, there's a lot.
So
And as environments change, animals go extinct, and so it's easy to imagine that the environment that they thrived in just doesn't exist.
it's just one theory. It's not no one was there, so we can't say for sure.
Like fire eater dragons. They say that
Yeah.
they hunted out because they were damaging humans and fire.
Technical question.
you're talking about going on top of mesas, going down to Peru, going all kinds of places in search of fossils. You know, for a guy like me, I go to a state park and stumble across some shale at, the bend in a creek. How do you go about looking for fossils? It seems like they're everywhere.
They are. They're all over. It's true.
So what technically does a geologist look for to see where there's a rich source of fossils? Let's face it, they're just pretty cool to find.
Yeah. Yeah, we were walking across the Peruvian desert, and I found this fossil shark, and the Peruvian paleontologist I was working with, it's like, oh, that's a mako shark. If it had a head, you'd be famous. um, but people just stumble. It's word of mouth. People stumble across stuff and write about it and tell other people. And, yeah. So we found there's fossil deposits that are extremely rich, and those are well known. And then there's other stuff that you just stumble across. And
we could go out here and dig a hole and go into the ground.
With all your interactions with evolutionists, have you ever convinced anyone of God? Through your studies,
So I had a friend who I did not know that he was an atheist, and because I knew that he had grown up Adventist, and he'd become an atheist, and he asked me and we met years later, had no idea, and he asked me what I was doing, and I just started telling what I was doing, and then he just kept asking questions, and I didn't know why he was asking me these questions. I was just having a conversation, and we got to a certain point, and he just threw his pencil down, and he's like, "It all makes sense." And so sometimes the problem really is information. He had been convinced by biology classes that evolution was true, and like William, was it? I think it was Blake wrote, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." So he'd become an atheist, but he was a little bit reluctant. And so when he saw a bunch of evidence for creation, that was good enough. Another time I gave a lecture at school where I taught, and I did not know that I had a bunch of kids in my class that did not come from any kind of religious background. They were exchange students, and it was an Adventist school, and so I was assuming most of my kids were Adventist or at least Christian. And so I gave this lecture for the chapel service, and at the end of the lecture, I had one of my classes walked in, and this Chinese kid, he walks past me, he's like, "You almost convinced me." So I don't know. I would say that, like, if you imagine the difficulty in changing your opinion from what it is now to, say, becoming a Muslim or becoming an atheist, that's the same kind of jump that they have to make to go from where they are to where we are. And so it's very difficult for someone to make that big of a jump all at once. So I mentioned my friend John Sanford in my sermon today. He was a professor of, he's a geneticist and evolutionist, and he gradually like I think his wife became a Christian. And then, and but the process of him going from evolutionist to Christian creationist, it was a long process. Um, and I can say the same for a lot of other well-known people. Like Anthony Flew was a famous atheist, and toward the end of he's a philosopher, and toward the end of his life, he became a deist. And again, I think it was a long process for him. Like C.S. Lewis tells about his conversion, and again, it took a while. And it's kind of funny. If I remember the story right, he's sitting on the bus, looks out the bus window, and he sees a flower, and it's like, if there's beauty in the world, it's got to be out of God. Um, and that was a very short version of the aesthetic argument for God's existence, but.
I don't want to get out either, and I just walked in, so I don't know what you covered. This morning you said that only 2/3 of the Adventists believe in creation.
So, well,
I have a further question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm wondering about the 1/3. If they don't believe in creation, why do they keep the Sabbath?
That's a good question. So the question was worded, do you strongly believe in a literal 6-day creation? And so, and only like 38 point something percent in the conference where I came from said yes, and out here it was 68.2%. So, or 63.2%. So, so I would say that I know people who believe in creation. They might believe that it was maybe a short period of time, but they're uncomfortable saying, yes, the Bible is literally completely true. For whatever reason, they're just uncomfortable with it.
So these ones that you say don't believe in a literal 7-day, are you saying that they don't believe in creation?
So I would say that in the Adventist system, we have kind of a different issue than other. Okay, for example, you might have heard of Mike Behe, Stephen Meyer, David Berlinski, some of these famous like ID kind of guys, although David Berlinski probably doesn't want me to call him an ID proponent, but he is. And so maybe he wouldn't object. Anyway, so these guys, I got to talk with them at a conference years ago, and they're all very much in favor of God's creative power, but long ages. William Dembski's another one. And we don't really have that in Adventism much. What we have is a division between materialists on one side and basically Bible is true on the other.
Well, my real question in there was they don't believe in the 7-day week creation or a 6-day week. Why do they keep the 7th day Sabbath?
So two things. One thing is that I think that there's a good number of them that see a lot of value in Adventism for whatever reason. Social reasons, health reasons, whatever reason they have, they see a lot of value in Adventism, and they don't want to let go of it. And then there's a different class, I think, of people, maybe some overlap, where they consider themselves Adventist. They don't want to not be Adventist, but they honestly believe that church doctrines are wrong and outdated, and they're doing us a favor by trying to rid the church of those old doctrines.
Now that you touched that, I have a question because I hear something that there is some people, like she mentioned, that is teaching in our school.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know how is the church allowing that, because I think that's completely outside our beliefs. How can they be Adventist, and how can they be allowed to teach that to our kids? In which schools are in that? Because I hear that not all of them.
That's true. I would say that Southern and Oakwood have been much more careful with their hiring process, and places like La Sierra have intentionally hired evolutionists to teach. Now they got their hands slapped pretty hard a few years ago, and so the chair of the biology department, I don't know if he's still there, but he was actually, I think he's still there. He's a creationist. But that was a recent development. La Sierra was teaching evolution for decades. And nobody did anything about it, I think partially because a lot of the administrators were right on board. Um, and it's not, because of the church structure, it's not Ted Wilson's job to fire a whole line of people all the way down to a professor at a college. And Ted Wilson's predecessors, I don't even know if they cared. And I don't want to speak ill of them, but there's a lot of stuff that happened that I saw happen, that my professors saw happen, that really shouldn't have happened. Um, okay, so how does plate tectonics, the rise of mountains, dinosaurs, yeah. So how does plate tectonics, dinosaurs, rise of mountains? The question was, how does that influence my spiritual journey, or when I look at things like that, so to give a little bit of background, we can see from the biblical record, Adam lived 930 years. Noah, 10 generations later, lived to be 950 years old. The earth, as God created it, was extraordinarily well designed for life, to the point where humans lived 10 times longer than we do now. And you can see that as soon as the environment changed, there was that precipitous drop in human longevity. And so what I see, and also I think, so God at the very beginning, God back before he even created the world, he put, he made the earth, he made the flood possible, built it into the design of the earth as a contingency plan. And so even back when before Adam and Eve sinned, there was this contingency plan. If they do sin, God, he's got everything planned out. And what God did by sending the flood was he reduced the earth to a much more marginal environment where humans would have far less capacity to, I think we have to work a lot harder to live, and that gives us a much lesser, we're just not as powerful. We're not physically capable or mentally capable of all of the evil that our pre-flood ancestors were. And so that was a way of God putting just kind of putting a limit on the amount of evil that humanity is capable of. So it's just interesting. So from that perspective, that tells me that God had everything very carefully planned out. We're in an environment now where if we live according to the laws that God has given us, we can be healthy, and have we can feel good. But if we don't follow those laws, we start to notice it. Whereas before the flood, you could probably break all kinds of laws of health and not ever feel it because the environment was so good. Now we've got a few decades to be evil if we choose, instead of several centuries. So that just, to me, that shows God's divine wisdom and oversight.
We think, unless somebody has a burning question, that's really a good tone to stop at. We've really been blessed by your presentations over the weekend. I know for me, I look forward to the day when we can sit around in heaven, if that's the way you want to put it, and really answer some of these questions. And I truly believe that we get to examine, I think that's our opportunity for judgment, if you will, to examine exactly what happened, not only to humanity, but how the earth aged through our existence here. There's a bunch of questions we get answered. We get to study all of the history of humanity, and I'm looking forward to that day. But Monty, we just really want to appreciate the way you blessed us this weekend, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We want to give you a little honorarium as a thank you. And we do look forward to a continued dialogue. And as you offer, I was glad for the offering today that as questions arise, you might read something published, or you might see something in some media source. Monty has promised us a clear and concise answer. Well, just thank you. As we close, can I pray and send us home with that blessing? Father, we just thank you so much once again for being able to listen to Monty and his expertise. Give us a clear understanding of your creation. And even with dedicated scientists, Father, we don't have all the answers. We pray for understanding the data and the science that we do know. Give us the confidence. Give us the clear thought that we can be good ambassadors for you and good disciples, good apologists towards your creation. That as we talk to friends and family on a topic such as this, that we can represent truth and not add to confusion. Father, now we ask for your dismissal, traveling mercies as we go to our home. Continue to bless our Sabbath day, and we just thank you for the day of rest that you've given us. This is our prayer in Jesus' name.